March 9, 1997. Los Angeles. It's after midnight. Christopher Wallace, the Notorious B.I.G, has just left a party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. Biggie is 24 years old. He's one of the biggest rappers alive. His new album, Life After Death, is only weeks away from release. And 6 months earlier, his former friend turned rival Tupac Shakur had been murdered in Las Vegas. Now Biggie is sitting in the passenger seat of a GMC Suburban. His entourage is moving through Los Angeles. They stop at a red light near Wilshire Boulevard, and then another vehicle pulls alongside them. The driver is described as a black man wearing a suit and bow tie. The window comes down. Shots explode into Biggie's vehicle. The other car speeds away. Biggie is rushed to Cedars Sinai Medical Center. He doesn't make it. At 1:15 in the morning, Christopher Wallace is pronounced dead, 24 years old, 6 months after Tupac. Two of the most important rappers of their generation, gone. But here's the part that makes Biggie's story different. Tupac's murder eventually produced an arrest. Decades later, Dwayne "Kef" D. Davis would finally stand in a courtroom while prosecutors attempted to prove their case. Biggie never got that moment. No murder trial, no jury, no defendant sitting at a table while witnesses took the stand. No verdict. Almost 3 decades later, nobody has ever been charged with murdering the Notorious B.I.G. And that doesn't mean investigators had no theories. Quite the opposite. There were many. One detective became convinced Biggie's murder was connected to corrupt Los Angeles police officers. Another investigation years later rejected key parts of that theory and identified an entirely different alleged shooter. Biggie's family sued the city of Los Angeles. That lawsuit produced a mistrial after the court found that police documents hadn't been properly disclosed. The FBI looked at aspects of the case. Gang connections were investigated. Death row connections were investigated. Police connections were investigated. Millions of people became convinced they knew who did it. And still, nobody went on trial. So today we're doing something very specific. We're not going to solve Biggie's murder from a YouTube video. We're going to separate 3 things that have been blended together for almost 30 years. What we know, what investigators theorized, and what was actually proven. Because once you separate those 3, the Biggie case becomes even stranger. If you rock with facts-based hip-hop storytelling, like, hype, and subscribe right now. We're growing fast because real ones recognize the work. No fake certainty. No conspiracy theory presented as fact. We're following the evidence wherever it actually goes. And this story begins before that red light. Because to understand why investigators immediately looked toward retaliation, you have to understand what happened 6 months earlier. Tupac was dead. Death row blamed its enemies. The East Coast-West Coast conflict had escaped the music. And now, Biggie was coming to Los Angeles. This is where hindsight makes everything feel inevitable. But it wasn't. By early 1997, Biggie was preparing for the release of Life After Death. His relationship with Tupac had become one of the most famous feuds in music. But Tupac was gone, and Biggie publicly denied having anything to do with his murder. Still, the atmosphere was dangerous. Death Row and Bad Boy had become symbols of something much bigger than 2 record labels. Tupac had attacked Biggie relentlessly in music. Biggie maintained that he wasn't responsible for what happened to Tupac. Fans picked sides. Magazines picked sides. Radio picked sides. And real gang relationships existed around parts of both entourages. That distinction is important. The East Coast-West Coast War was partly media mythology. New York wasn't literally at war with California, but there were real people with real conflicts surrounding these artists. And when Tupac was murdered in Las Vegas on September 7, 1996, speculation immediately pointed in multiple directions. 6 months later, Biggie arrives in Los Angeles. He attends the Soul Train Music Awards. Then comes the party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. Hundreds of people are there. Celebrities, music industry figures, security, police. Eventually the party shuts down. Biggie leaves. Multiple vehicles carrying his entourage pull out. And shortly afterward, his Suburban stops at a light. That's when the shooter appears. 4 bullets strike Wallace. And almost immediately, investigators have a terrifying possibility in front of them. Was this retaliation for Tupac? On the surface, the theory practically writes itself. Tupac gets murdered. 6 months later, his biggest rival gets murdered. Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Death Row, Bad Boy, 2 drive-by shootings, 2 global rap stars. Neither reaches 26. But something feeling obvious is not the same as proving it. And that principle is going to follow us through this entire video. Because investigators now needed answers to very basic questions. Who was the shooter? How did the shooter know where Biggie would be? Was Biggie specifically targeted? Who had a motive? Was somebody following his entourage? Was the killing connected to Tupac? Was it gang retaliation? Was it something else entirely? And then the investigation started moving in a direction that nobody could have predicted. Not toward another rapper. Not initially toward a record executive. Toward the LAPD itself. And the detective who followed that road would eventually become almost as famous as the case he was investigating. His name was Russell Poole. And what he believed he discovered would transform Biggie's murder from an unsolved drive-by into an alleged police corruption scandal. Russell Poole was an LAPD detective, and if you've watched documentaries about Biggie's murder, you've probably heard his name. Poole began investigating connections that he believed existed between corrupt police officers, death row records, and Wallace's murder. And you need to understand the environment inside the LAPD at the time. Los Angeles was approaching the Rampart scandal. Officers connected to the department's Rampart division would be implicated in serious misconduct, corruption, evidence problems, false testimony, improper shootings, gang relationships. The idea of a corrupt cop wasn't some fantasy invented for a Biggie documentary. LAPD corruption was a real scandal that made what Poole began investigating feel explosive. One name was David Mack. Mack was an LAPD officer who would later be convicted for robbing a bank. Investigators also examined his relationships and alleged connections surrounding death row. Another name emerged. Amir Muhammad, also known as Harry Billups. Poole developed a theory that Muhammad may have been the shooter and that corrupt officers could have been connected to the killing. Muhammad denied involvement. He was never charged with Biggie's murder. And this is where I need you to pay close attention to our language. Poole's theory became enormously famous. That does not mean Poole's theory became a proven fact. There is a gigantic difference between a detective suspected this and investigators proved this in court. No jury ever convicted David Mack of involvement in Biggie's murder. No jury ever convicted Amir Muhammad. No criminal trial established that LAPD officers murdered Biggie. But Poole became increasingly convinced he was onto something. And eventually he believed his investigation was being obstructed. He left the LAPD. From there, the story exploded into books, documentaries, and allegations that the department had either failed to properly investigate its own officers, or something worse. And you can see why the theory became irresistible. One of the biggest rappers alive is murdered. The case goes nowhere. A detective says corrupt police may be involved. The police department itself is entering a historic corruption scandal. Then that detective leaves the department. That's the kind of sequence that generates conspiracy theories for decades. But here's where this video gets interesting. Because years later, another LAPD detective would investigate Biggie's murder. And he would essentially say, Russell Poole got the shooter wrong. His name was Greg Kading. And Kading's theory still involved retaliation. It still involved death row. But the man he identified as Biggie's alleged killer was somebody completely different. Before we get there, hit subscribe. Because this is exactly what HyperRealHoodStories is about. Not choosing the most dramatic theory and pretending it's solved. We're putting the competing investigations next to each other and asking the question that matters. What can actually be proven? Then Biggie's family did something incredibly important. They went to court. Not criminal court. Civil court. Wallace's mother, Valletta Wallace, along with members of his family, pursued a wrongful death case against the city of Los Angeles. The allegations were enormous. The family's case drew heavily from concerns that police misconduct or failures surrounding the investigation had prevented the truth from coming out. And suddenly the Biggie case had something it had never really had before. Discovery, documents, depositions, police records, people being forced to answer questions inside an actual legal proceeding. This wasn't somebody sitting down for a documentary interview. This was litigation. And in 2005, something extraordinary happened. The civil trial ended in a mistrial. Why? Because information had not been properly disclosed to the Wallace family's attorneys. Think about how that looked from the outside. For years, people had accused the LAPD of hiding something. Then Biggie's family finally gets the city into court. and the trial blows up over undisclosed police material. If you already believed in a cover-up, this looked like confirmation. But again, we need to separate what happened from what people concluded. The mistrial was real. The disclosure failure was serious. But a discovery violation does not automatically prove that LAPD officers murdered Biggie. And it doesn't prove that the department intentionally protected his killer. Those are separate claims requiring separate evidence. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when discussing this case. Something suspicious happens, and then every larger theory attached to it gets treated as automatically true. That's not how evidence works. The civil litigation continued through years of procedural battles. But the Wallace family never received the thing they wanted most. A courtroom finding explaining who killed Christopher Wallace. And then something else happened. The murder investigation was reopened. Now imagine you're the LAPD. You're facing allegations that your own officers were somehow connected to one of the most infamous unsolved murders in America. You're facing enormous civil exposure. And the underlying homicide is still unsolved. You need another investigation, a new team, a fresh look. That's where Greg Kading enters the story. And this is the point where the Biggie investigation basically splits into two different realities. Russell Poole believed one set of people were involved. Greg Kading would come to believe something else. Both roads touched death row. Both roads touched Suge Knight. But when Kading reached the alleged gunman, he didn't identify a cop. He identified a gang member, Wardell Poochie Faust. And if Kading was right, Biggie's murder wasn't carried out by a rogue LAPD officer. It was something simultaneously simpler and almost impossible to prosecute. Greg Kading was an LAPD detective assigned years later to a task force investigating the murders of Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace. And Kading's investigation produced a radically different theory. According to Kading, Biggie's murder was retaliation for Tupac, but not in the way Russell Poole believed. Kading alleged that Suge Knight arranged the killing from prison. He identified a mob Pyru gang member and Knight associate named Wardell Poochie Faust as the alleged shooter. Let me emphasize this. Faust was never convicted of killing Biggie. He was never even put on trial for it. What we're describing is Kading's investigative conclusion. According to Kading, investigators obtained information from a woman he referred to publicly under the pseudonym Teresa Swan. Kading said she described acting as an intermediary between Knight and Faust. His theory was essentially this. Tupac gets murdered. Knight believes enemies connected to Bad Boy are responsible. Biggie comes to Los Angeles. Knight allegedly wants retaliation. Faust allegedly carries out the shooting. Kading has said the alleged payment to Faust was $13,000. Now compare that to Russell Poole. Poole's theory. Corrupt cops. David Mack. Amir Muhammad. Possible death row connections. Kading. No. Wrong shooter. Wrong mechanism. He points instead toward Poochie Faust and an alleged murder-for-hire arrangement connected to Knight. Two investigators. Same murder. Different alleged gunman. And this is exactly why you should be skeptical whenever somebody titles a video. Biggie murder solved. Solved how? Investigatively? Legally? According to which detective? Because there is no criminal verdict settling the dispute. Kading has publicly argued that investigators effectively figured out what happened. But knowing what you believe happened and possessing evidence sufficient to prosecute somebody beyond a reasonable doubt are not the same thing. And there was another enormous problem. By the time Kading's theory became public, Wardell Faust was dead. He had been shot and killed in Compton in 2003. So the man Kading identified as the alleged trigger man could never be arrested and questioned about Biggie, could never stand trial, could never confront the witnesses against him, could never be cross-examined, could never be convicted. And Suge Knight? He was never charged with Biggie's murder either. So we arrive at this bizarre situation. A former LAPD detective says he believes his team identified the shooter and the alleged person behind the killing. Another respected detective had previously pursued a substantially different theory. Neither theory produced a Biggie murder prosecution, and the public is left with something deeply unsatisfying. Investigative conclusions, without a verdict. This is the question that matters. If investigators developed all these theories, why was nobody charged? Because a murder case isn't a documentary. You don't get to show a jury a web of interesting connections and say, come on, you know what happened. Every important piece creates another legal question. Can the witness testify? Is the witness credible? Can their statement be corroborated? Is it hearsay? Did they personally observe what they're describing? Did investigators pressure them? Did their story change? Can the defense cross-examine them? Is the alleged shooter alive? Can you prove an alleged payment? Can you prove who ordered it? Can you prove the motive? And can you establish all of that beyond a reasonable doubt? Now look at the Biggie case. Years passed. Memories deteriorated. Witnesses became harder to locate. Some people died. The investigative theories changed. The department itself became part of the controversy. And the Wallace family's civil litigation added another layer of conflict. The Biggie case became a perfect example of something people hate hearing. Police may strongly suspect something without prosecutors possessing a criminal case they're confident they can win. And sometimes investigators disagree about what even happened. That's why the title of this video matters. The murder case that never got a trial. Biggie never got a jury hearing the government's best theory. His mother never got to sit behind prosecutors while a defendant faced the evidence. The public never got to watch witnesses cross-examined and decide which story survived. Instead, we got books, documentaries, interviews, leaks, lawsuits, police theories, conspiracy theories, and decades of arguments. Compare that with Tupac. For decades, Tupac's case looked almost equally hopeless. Then Dwayne Davis was arrested. Suddenly, old interviews became potential evidence. Old witnesses became courtroom witnesses. The MGM footage became trial evidence. And the Mythology had to confront legal procedure. That's exactly what Biggie's case never received. And that's why the Tupac trial happening now makes Biggie's unresolved murder feel even more extraordinary. Two murders that were culturally fused together for almost 30 years. One finally reaches a courtroom. The other still hasn't. If you rock with this kind of breakdown, like this video, hype it, and subscribe. We're growing fast because real ones recognize the work. We don't need to make the story crazier than it already is. The actual story is crazy enough. Because there's still another question. If the police theories changed, and the alleged gunman either denied involvement or died, what does it actually mean to call Biggie's case unsolved? Because unsolved doesn't necessarily mean investigators have absolutely no idea what happened. Sometimes it means something more frustrating. They can't prove it. You've probably seen the claim before. Biggie's murder was solved years ago. Maybe, but that sentence hides the most important word. Solved by whom? Russell Poole believed he had uncovered a connection involving corrupt officers. Greg Kading believed a different investigation identified Wardell Faust as the shooter and Suge Knight as the alleged person behind the hit. Other writers, investigators, and filmmakers have challenged pieces of both theories. Amir Muhammad publicly denied being the killer. Suge Knight was never charged in connection with Biggie's death. Wardell Faust died without ever facing the accusation in court. And nobody has ever been convicted. So when HyperRealHoodStories says this case is unsolved, we're using the standard that matters. There is no criminal adjudication establishing who murdered Christopher Wallace. That doesn't mean every theory is equally credible. It doesn't mean investigators learn nothing. It means the legal system never reached an answer. And this is where I want to push back on something that happens constantly in hip-hop storytelling. Certainty sells. We know who did it gets more clicks then. Investigators developed a theory that was never tested at trial. But those are not the same statement. And when we're talking about real people and murder allegations, that difference matters. So let's return to what we know. Biggie was in Los Angeles. He left the Peterson Automotive Museum after party. His vehicle stopped near Wilshire and Fairfax. A shooter pulled alongside. Gunfire entered the Suburban. Christopher Wallace was killed. He was 24. No one has ever been charged with his murder. Everything after that requires another label. Evidence, witness statement, investigative theory, allegation, denial, speculation. And once you label those things correctly, you can actually see why the case is so difficult. The public wants one clean answer. The record gives us competing investigations. And that's why Biggie's murder has survived for almost 30 years as one of hip-hop's greatest unanswered questions. But here's the part that bothers me most. Biggie wasn't some mythical character. Christopher Wallace was somebody's son. He was a father. He was 24 years old. And the endless mythology can make people forget that underneath every theory is a very simple fact. A young man was murdered in public. There were people everywhere. And nearly 3 decades later, his family still never saw anyone stand trial for it. That should be more shocking than any conspiracy theory. And now, in 2026, there's a strange symmetry. The Tupac case is finally being tested in court. Witnesses are taking the stand. Evidence is being challenged. Old statements are being examined. And a jury will eventually be asked whether prosecutors actually proved their allegations. For Biggie, we still don't have that. And watching the Tupac trial unfold reveals exactly what Biggie's case has always been missing. Cross-examination. That's the machine designed to test stories. Imagine if Russell Poole's theory had reached a criminal trial. Defense lawyers could attack every alleged connection. Imagine if Kading's theory had reached one. Witness credibility could be challenged in front of jurors. Financial allegations could be tested. Timelines could be reconstructed. Investigators could explain why their conclusions changed. The accused could confront the evidence. Instead, the public has spent decades performing its own trial. On YouTube, Reddit, podcasts, documentaries, barbershops, comment sections, and social media, people pick whichever theory feels most convincing and pronounce a verdict. But that's not justice. And it's not investigation. It's opinion. So I'm not going to end this video by dramatically revealing. This is definitely who killed Biggie. Because I can't prove that. Neither can the people making thumbnails saying they solved it. What I can tell you is that serious investigators develop theories. Some overlap. Some contradict each other. Some evidence became the subject of litigation. Some witnesses have been attacked as unreliable. Some suspects died. Some denied everything. And no prosecutor ever put the complete Biggie murder case in front of a criminal jury. That is the story. And strangely, it's more interesting than pretending we have a secret answer. Because Biggie's murder isn't mysterious because nobody ever looked. It's mysterious because so many people looked. And they still couldn't produce a conviction. And now I want to know what you think. Not, who does the internet say did it? Here's the real question. Which investigative theory do you believe deserves the most scrutiny? And what evidence makes you believe it? Russell Poole? Greg Kading? Or do you think neither theory has ever been strong enough to justify a prosecution? Put your answer in the comments. But bring receipts. Because this community is going to be about facts, not just picking teams. Christopher Wallace died on March 9, 1997. He was 24 years old. His second album wasn't even out yet. Life After Death would arrive 16 days later. And Biggie would never see what it became. He would never see himself become one of the most influential rappers in history. Never see decades of artists borrow his flows. Never see Brooklyn treat his image like a monument. Never see his children grow up. And he would never see anyone prosecuted for taking his life. That's what separates this story from the mythology surrounding it. Almost 30 years later, people still ask, who killed Biggie? Maybe one of the investigators we've discussed was right. Maybe important pieces are still missing. Maybe law enforcement knows more than it can prove. Maybe evidence that could have settled the case disappeared decades ago. But until allegations become evidence strong enough to survive a courtroom, the honest answer remains. No one has ever been convicted of Christopher Wallace's murder, and his case never got the trial that could have forced these competing stories to face each other. That's why this matters right now, because we're watching the Tupac case do exactly that. 30 years of stories are being dragged into court and tested. Witnesses can be challenged. Statements can be compared. Evidence can be admitted or rejected. And a jury, not a YouTube comment section, will ultimately decide whether the government proved its case. Biggie's family never got that moment. At least not in a murder prosecution. And maybe someday that changes. Until then, we're going to keep doing what this channel is rapidly becoming known for. Taking the biggest stories in hip-hop, stripping away the mythology, and showing you where the facts end and the allegations begin. If you rock with facts-based storytelling, do 3 things right now. Like the video, hit HYP, and subscribe to HyperRealHoodStories. We're growing fast because real ones recognize the work. And if you're one of the people who found us through the Tupac trial coverage, welcome. This channel is going much deeper. We're covering the cases, the history, the courtrooms, the forgotten details, and the stories hip-hop has argued about for decades. So subscribe and turn on notifications because we've got a lot coming. Then watch our Tupac investigation next. Because Tupac and Biggie's stories have been tied together for almost 3 decades. But in 2026, their cases have reached 2 completely different destinations. One has finally reached a jury. The other remains one of the most famous unsolved murders in music history. Tupac finally got a trial. Biggie never did. And until somebody can walk into a courtroom and actually prove who murdered Christopher Wallace, the question remains, who killed Biggie? This is Hyper Real Hood Stories. Facts over mythology, evidence over rumors. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next investigation.